Oh my gosh, I'm actually slowly.
Check 1, 2, 3. Good morning. Annika, I think you actually want to be outside. No, it's okay. I mean, I don't think anyone, I mean, you're still a couple of minutes early, so. Yeah, like right by those, yeah, right out there.
That's it. Yeah, I really want to take a geology class. I like obviously there are always computers. So I think I'm gonna try getting ways for that. If not, there's some there's I think it's really fun and really starts right? But the student of practice is something that class. I would be yeah, like on Tuesday we can go. No, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Because I got the big problem with the class is okay, the monthly time the math student has to be done. So, but like, so math classes like really afternoon. I could totally do it in 4 hours. Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Which might be a lot, but also like, I feel like that's not really.
Hey,
How are you?
Good.
Give me a sense of how many students because
20. Yeah, I think if you talk for a little while out there for the first couple of minutes in front of it, then I think you'd have everyone. They're usually not terribly late, so. Yeah.
You sent me the groups, but I didn't know.
Right. Well, there are 4 per group, so it should be 20. I know we're missing a couple today. So,
Do you know about the community board? No. It sounded so cool. It was like you were like it's like a bit of like a yeah, but I don't know. I didn't see much of it. It seems like it's just kind of like making sure that like yeah, like
hey there. Bryn, you are actually out there.
oh my god.
It's okay. You can leave your stuff here if you want. You're actually probably better off leaving your stuff because you're going to be going through the thing.
Yeah, I feel like 9 a.m. to noon. Yeah.
All right, cool. Come on in. So you guys are all going to be back row people this morning because that's how we're starting. It's okay. How are you, David? Good. All right, so I'm gonna start talking because we're doing a split today, and Ella, you know you're outside, right? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna start, guys, because we're doing a split. I'm gonna talk with you for about half the class, and then we're gonna flip, and then at the very end you'll come back in here. But the other half of the class is doing a tour of Living Machine first. So you just don't want too many people in it at the same time. It's too small. So that's why we're kind of splitting the class. So what I'm going to talk with you about today is the field of ecological engineering, which is kind of a subfield of this larger field of ecological design. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but just to do a quick check-in on other course-related details. I hope most of you have scheduled your interviews and are good to go in terms of that. I know some of you have been reaching out to Harriet and I and asking us some questions about like what's appropriate as far as reaching out to people. And for those of you who have not yet made contact yet, I would say at least 3 attempts to make contact before we try something else. We do have a few, if it becomes impossible to get in contact with a person that you were paired with, we do have a couple spare people in the wings who we can potentially have you interviewing. It wouldn't be on the same topic, but for most of you, but so that's a possibility. But please do keep us apprised of like where you are in the process and if you're having any challenges, and Harriet or I will try to help you out as best we can and poke people. Everyone who was assigned as an interviewee, or people who volunteered for it. So they should be up for it. It's just sometimes it's hard to get a hold of people. It's not that they're not willing. It's just sometimes people are hard to get a hold of. So that's a thing. Sorry about a little bit of confusion about the survey, which should have been posted at the beginning of this week, but I don't directly do that. So I wasn't really sure when it had gone out. Hopefully everyone has that now. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I actually know, because I was waiting for that email to come out to respond to all the people. I was poking the people who are responsible for sending it out. It's better if you answer it in the first link you got than in the one I sent you, but it doesn't make that much difference at this point. Yes, okay. So the other thing I wanted to just mention is, of course, we have the case study. So hopefully you guys are finding a way to interact with each other and connect about ideas with respect to food policy for that last case. Any questions on anything I've said so far before we get into ecological engineering? All right, cool. So I have about half an hour with you, and then we're going to do the swap, like I said. So I want to provide some broad context, which is actually, it builds on, as I say, ecological engineering is a particular branch of this emerging field we discussed called ecological design. And I want to kind of explain that connection. And so I'll do a little bit of a review before I start getting into the details of what exactly ecological design is. But back to this sort of image that I regularly show of the reality, for most of the 10,000 years of modern human evolution, we're human beings, mostly agrarian in most cultures, and our agricultural ecosystems operated on sunlight. We found coal, positive feedback, exponential growth and use of that natural resource, decoupling of society. So I'll just repeat, but one of the things we talked about is the scale of our impact as a result of that increase from local to regional to global. And we talked a little bit about agricultural impacts of that. So, we talked before about how this sort of like positive feedback, reliance on fossil fuel dramatically affected our agricultural systems. And among other things, substantially increased the amount of food that we could produce and substantially reduce the amount of people necessary to produce that food. So, we can and we do get into all the negative environmental consequences of this transformation. But the reality is that it's created a situation where a lot of people spend a lot of time in non-agricultural activities, and some of those are wonderful activities that we engage in. So it's not all a bad thing, that transformation that occurred. It is what it is, but it's resulted in a bunch of challenges that we're now facing and trying to address. And among those challenges are, that is the largest watershed, as you know, in the United States. That's the Mississippi River watershed. All of that land area in the United States drains into one river, the Mississippi River, which drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it accumulates all of that excess nutrients from agricultural land. And causes a lot of problems for the ecosystems off the coast, dead zones, that sort of thing. All right, so, and then the last class, we talked a little bit about this breakdown in sort of this physical separation of humans, food, and waste, where it used to be everything was recycled on a farm, people moved to cities, we end up with what used to be recycled back onto farmlands, ending up going into landfills or down into downstream ecosystems, this sort of separation of humans first from the farms into cities, and then last century, the separation of food animals and primary producers, and resulting in a situation where for most people, the experience of eating is very, very separate from the experience of agriculture, the production of that food. Most people really don't have much of a sense of where their food comes from or the ecological implications of that food. Okay, so everything I've said so far is kind of review. I kind of want to move now from talking about that input side, which actually does also fit into the field of ecological engineering, to talk a little bit about the output side. So as you guys know, there's been this enormous focus on local foods movement, people getting really excited about understanding where their food comes from, going shopping at local farmers markets, supporting community-supported agriculture enterprises, this sort of realization of people wanting to have this deeper connection with their food, wanting their what they eat and how they eat it and how that food is produced to be consistent with the sort of value of location and local recycling of materials and supporting the local economy. A lot of really neat things in that local foods movement. We haven't yet got to the flip side of that, although I think we could get there, is in thinking about not just where what comes into our body goes to, but where what goes out of our body goes to. There's not a local shit movement yet. There's a local food movement, but not yet a local poop movement. But it's nevertheless part of the same situation where, we're disconnected. For most people, you flush the toilet and that stuff's gone. And very, very few people, I think, could tell you what happens to that, where it goes, what its impact is on downstream ecosystems, how much energy is being consumed, what it is in fact doing. It's pretty much out of sight and therefore out of mind. And I have this lovely picture of my niece, who was much younger when this was shot, because children don't have that sense of separation. They're super interested in where their food comes from, where their poop goes. We are not born with that sense of disconnection. That's a cultural thing, that sort of sense that it goes away. Put it in this bowl, put the thing down, or it goes down a drain, and it goes away. Kids have a fascination with that stuff, so it's sort of a learned thing. Just as a small anecdote about that child there, she is just finishing up her PhD at Berkeley in food science right now, so she's considerably older now and has retained that fascination with where her food comes from and the consequences of that. So there you go. But for many people, it goes into the ground, disappears, goes away. I do want to address that issue a little bit today and talk a little bit about how the living machine fits into that. So we talked about this sort of decoupling between humans and nature, fossil fuels, the problem of living on a non-renewable resource, typical patterns of things that grow on non-renewable resources. They go up, they go down as the stock is depleted on which they grow on. And in fact, as I've said many times before, this would be the idealized situation of a population growing on a non-renewable resource that gradually dissipated and it wasn't the problems we face. The problems we face with consuming fossil fuels are less that we're running out of the stuff and more that the stuff is polluting the atmosphere, and that pollution in the atmosphere is sort of affecting our ecosystems in ways that are potentially catastrophic, not sort of a gradual downhill slope as is presented here, but potentially some extreme situations. So the key question that we began to address when we started this discussion of ecological design is how do we get out of this mess in a way that's not incredibly painful for us and for the rest of humanity, particularly those parts of humanity that live in what used to be called the developing world, the global south, people of less affluence, because they are first in line to be affected by these negative effects of climate change and other impacts. So Where's the soft landing, I guess, is kind of the question of ecological engineering, ecological design in general, and ecological engineering. How do we find a way to sort of recouple ourselves with nature so we're operating within the limits of what's provided by solar energy, our ability to completely recycle materials? How do we get from here to there, some sort of stability? And, we talked about some of the technologies involved, renewable energy technology, but what I want to focus on for the remainder today is a particular branch of ecological design, which is termed ecological engineering. And it's one of the parts of design for transition. So I'll write all these down. These are the 10 principles we already discussed about ecological design. So we talked about that at an earlier class. We talked about questions for ecological designers that deal with all three of the major components of sustainability: equity and justice, economy and ecology. How do we ensure that what we're building is achieving those goals? So as I say, for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about a particular sub-branch of ecological design called ecological engineering. Ecological engineering focuses specifically on the sort of biological, ecological components of design. So this is a definition of ecological engineering: the facilitated development of whole, complex, solar-powered, resource-efficient ecosystems designed to maximize specific ecosystem goods and services. So I'll say that again. I mean, I'll post the overheads, obviously, so you don't necessarily need to write it down. But what we're talking about here is trying to develop ecosystems. They're not natural ecosystems, but they exhibit key properties of natural ecosystems in that they're diverse. They operate on solar energy. They're resource efficient, but they're specifically designed. These are ecosystems specifically designed to produce goods and services for our economy. And you could say, well, that's what agricultural systems are for. They're designed to produce goods and services. They are ecosystems. The cornfield across the street from me is an ecosystem that's designed to produce goods and services for our economy. That's true, but it doesn't meet the full criteria because it is not fully solar powered. It's not particularly complex. It's actually simplified. So it doesn't fit into that. But agro ecosystems, any sophisticated ecosystem that's designed to produce food for us or fuel for us or fiber for us, and is also designed to principally run on solar energy and recycle materials. That's an example of an ecologically engineered agro ecosystem. But there are many applications of ecological engineering, and I'll talk about a few of them, and then focus on the living machine as a particular example of an ecologically engineered system. But I want to go back a step and focus on these two terms that I've kind of thrown out there, ecosystem goods and services, and just say a little bit more about ecosystem goods and services. So if we think about ecosystems as kind of being like a factory or a business in general produces goods and services for our economy. Ecosystems do that too, and that's one of the insights of a field called ecological economics, is that we need to start thinking about how the ecosystems around us contribute to our economy. And when we begin to sort of frame things that way and think about what are the ecosystems providing that allow us to operate an economy, there's kind of two things we might focus on. One is sustainable yield. Sustainable yield is how much goods and services you can harvest from ecosystems around you without damaging. So harvest from them in a way that allows you to operate them over the long term. So what's the maximum sustainable yield? So that's a term that's very often used when we're talking about ecological systems, is what's the maximum sustainable yield, a yield that we can get indefinitely without harming, without damaging what we would call natural capital, the ability of that system. So for instance, I keep coming back to this, but the brown in the water that flows down Plum Creek, that's a sign that we're undermining the natural capital that provides us with goods and services. That's indicating that the farmlands upstream are going to be able to provide less and less services in the future because we're losing topsoil, which is critical to their ability to produce a maximum yield. Until the water going down the Plum Creek is clean, we basically have an indication that we're mining our agricultural lands, basically. So our sustainable yield is going down because it's not actually sustainable. Okay, so one side is the input side. How do we maximize the amount of food, fuel, and fiber we can get from the ecosystems around us? The flip side of that is assimilative capacity. That is, how much of what we currently call waste can we release into the natural ecosystems around us and have those ecosystems basically detoxify that. So this really goes back to our discussion of wetlands in that case, for instance, where we discussed how wetlands have a variety of valuable functions in terms of the services they're providing. And one of the most valuable functions of wetlands is their capacity, their assimilative capacity, their capacity to take materials, to take dirty water that flows through them and make that water clean. That's their assimilative capacity. They're assimilating that dirtiness, be it sediments, or be it nutrients, or be it organic toxins. The wetland is good at processing the nutrients, turning it into plant material. It's good at detoxifying toxins that flow through it. So it has a lot of assimilative capacity. So again, important that you can distinguish between sustainable yield and assimilative capacity. And then a third important function that we're increasingly recognizing is stability and resilience, the ability of ecosystems to enhance our resilience. So for instance, we've talked maybe a teeny bit about urban trees, street trees, planting them. The goods and services they're providing, among other things, are shade and the ability to take up water, which is going to increase our resilience in the face of increased extreme temperature events and increased flooding events. So there's a lot of value in them. And we talked about how wetlands, part of the reason that New Orleans was so damaged by Hurricane Katrina was because of all the damage to wetlands. Wetlands do a good job of taking storm surges, intense wave action coming in from offshore during an extreme weather event, and dampening that. The plant materials basically create friction that slows the water down and prevents the flooding from occurring in the same way. So these are all examples of ecosystem goods and services provided that are important and that we want to maximize. So ecological engineering is about thinking explicitly about those goods and services and trying to build up the ecosystems around us that provide those goods and services, planting more street trees, restoring wetlands, etc. So these are some examples of kind of different areas of ecological engineering. I talked a little bit about pollution treatment. We've talked about restoration and mitigation before. Biomanipulation is an interesting term. Biomanipulation is used to describe where you take an existing ecosystem and you modify it a little bit to make it give us more goods and services. So for instance, it might involve taking an aquatic ecosystem and modifying it in some way so it produces more food for us. So doing small things that allow it to produce more food. Again, the key thing is making sure we're doing that in the context of maximizing sustainable yield, not damaging the thing. Lots of examples of where we biomanipulate ecosystems and end up damaging them. A great example of that is the mangrove swamps of the world, many of which have been sort of enclosed and turned into shrimp farms, and it ends up damaging the mangroves. They end up dying, and a lot of shrimp is produced, but it's not a sustainable situation. It's aquaculture, but it's not eco-aquaculture. So sustainable agriculture, sustainable aquaculture, designing aquatic ecosystems that can produce a lot of food, designing terrestrial ecosystems that produce a lot of food, but are complex ecosystems that operate on sunlight. Now, in an ideal world, what you're actually trying to do is get many of these happening at the same time. So you're going to take a look at our living machine. There was a period of time when we had some fish in our living machine. Those fish are no longer with us. They were with us for many years. We should restock the thing. But there are places in the world where they have, especially in China, China's kind of ahead of us on this, where they have developed aquatic ecosystems. So they're ecologically engineered aquatic ecosystems that treat human waste, that produce plant material that can be fed to animals, food animals, and produce fish within those same ecosystems. So they're getting three functions out of the same ecosystem. They're treating waste, eliminating waste, they're directly producing food, and they're producing materials that can be turned into food. So that's an ideal situation where you're stacking function. We talked about that when we had our conversation about ecological design. Ideally, you're stacking as many functions on top of each other as possible. It's it's an example of systems thinking. You're trying to think systemically. How can we think about the whole system? How do we stack as much function? Great example of that is the reading for last class, or maybe 2 classes ago. Joel is it Salatin or Salazar? Help me out here. From the Michael Pollan reading. Anyways, that Polyface Farms, where his whole idea is, let's develop agricultural ecosystems in which everything has multiple functions at the same time. So the pigs are, you're not just producing pigs, the pigs are actually turning over your compost pile, so that you don't have to physically turn over the compost pile because they do it. So I gave you design principles for ecological design in general. I want to go through a set of principles which is very similar, very parallel, but it's got some differences because it focuses on ecosystems, and so there's some differences there. But one key thing, this is true of both ecological design and ecological engineering as a subfield of ecological design, trying to mimic the structure and function of natural ecosystems. So trying to really understand how natural ecosystems work, and then thinking about, well, how can we construct ecosystems that have those same properties within them, but are optimized to produce food, fuel, or fiber for human society. Running them on solar energy, that's obviously really important. Feedback controls, that was another principle we already talked about. This is kind of a little bit of a new one: guided self-design or self-organization. So designing ecosystems in which you understand as a designer that you don't actually have full control over how the ecosystem is going to work. So you're going to allow the system to do some self-organization and develop its own sort of communities. And oftentimes what that involves is something we call multiple seeding. So I'll give you an example of that. When we first started the Living Machine, we basically went to ecosystems all over the world, really, and collected material. We knew we wanted the thing to operate 365 days a year in a temperate environment. So we knew it had to have tropical plants as part of its ecosystem. So that was an important component of it. We also went to local ecosystems, gathered a lot of sediment from places like Plum Creek, and basically put it all together and kind of let the ecosystem sort itself out. So we put sewage through it because that's what the Living Machine does. It treats all the wastewater in this building. When you flush a toilet or put water down the drain, all of it goes through there. But we did multiple seeding. We put a lot of different biological sources in it and essentially let the ecosystem work itself out and form an ecosystem that would treat this material going through it. So that's this principle of self-design and self-organization. It's probably the part of ecological engineering that traditional engineers have the hardest time with conceptually and psychologically, because they're trained in a mentality which is all about sort of like fully understanding everything and not about allowing things to self-organize. That's just not part of normal engineering. So it's actually a challenge to get engineers involved in this stuff because it's just not how they're trained or where they're trained. They're usually also not trained in this idea of sort of maximizing diversity within the system. So like I say, we took lots of material from lots of different sources, put it together. Some of it lived, some of it didn't live, but it developed this complex ecosystem that treats the wastewater in this building. A lot of times what we're trying to do is take what would occur over large areas in nature and condense them into a small space. And what that means is trying to capture what would occur in a large space, many ecosystems in a small space. And so I'll put this next one down here too, because it's related. One of the ways you can get heterogeneity, that is a lot of different ecosystems with a lot of different biogeochemical environments, is by modularizing things, putting things in a lot of different tanks that are next to each other. So you can have one tank that represents one kind of ecosystem with flow out of it into another tank that represents a different kind of ecosystem. And so essentially what you're doing is you're capturing processes that might occur over, square kilometers or square miles in space and putting them into, 100 square feet or a couple hundred square feet to sort of facilitate those relations, to facilitate the proximity that would occur in nature. And you'll see that when you go into the living machine, lots of tanks, each of which is sort of optimized for different ecology. So it's a lot of ecosystems. It's actually not one ecosystem, it's many ecosystems, but they're very close together and water flows from one to another, and different kinds of transformation occur in each of those. And I want to sort of get specific now. So like I say, the field of ecological design covers a lot of different areas, but just as an example, we're going to focus on pollution treatment and specifically on water pollution treatment. So there are a bunch of ways that we could clean water, right? And I want to talk about a few of those. One is a traditional engineering approach. So in 1970, the Clean Water Act was passed, and it actually required communities to install a lot of large engineered systems that basically use physics, chemistry, microbiology to clean water. So any community the size of Oberlin usually has a wastewater treatment plant. Anything bigger has big wastewater treatment plants. But this is a traditional engineering solution, big tanks. Sometimes people get it in their head that this is mostly a chemical process. That's not true. Wastewater treatment is mostly a microbiological process. It's not, I mean, it's a chemical process, but it's a chemistry that involves microbes doing most of that work. But with these big tanks, you get a lot of control, precision, and economy of scale. They do tend to use a lot of energy. If you look at the municipality of Oberlin, Ohio, and you ask, where are the largest sources of carbon emissions for running the city? Water production is the second largest source of greenhouse gases. So you might think, well, we're right near, Lake Erie, we're near the Great Lakes, there's lots of water here. Probably doesn't take that much energy to get us water or treat water. Not true. It still takes a lot of energy to treat water. So very energy intensive traditional wastewater treatment systems. Another, yes.
What's the largest consumer of CO2?
It was electricity production for the city. Yeah, actually now we're carbon neutral on that. So it's a little, things have shifted a little bit. It's a little, yeah, but it would have been electricity production. Yeah. Okay, so another option is restoring lots of natural ecosystems. We've talked about how valuable wetlands are for treating water. They're very resource efficient, potentially cost effective, because once you put them in, they can do their own thing. And there are whole communities in the United States that have basically just built big wetlands as their wastewater treatment system. There's a famous one in Humboldt, California. You looked with familiarity, Bridget, when I said Humboldt. Have you been there? Do you know Humboldt?
No, there's a place in Texas called Humboldt, but is it?
Oh, okay. Well, there are a bunch of places around. There actually are some places down south that have wetland-based wastewater treatment systems. Down south, they do some interesting work with cypress swamp, using them for wastewater treatment. But they're cool. The problem is they're very land intensive. You need large areas of land. So the sort of intermediate position is an ecologically engineered one, where again you're constructing these miniaturized ecosystems so that you can pack them into a small space. And I don't want to sort of leave you with like the thought that one of these is better than another. There's definitely a place, you're not going to build in New York City, you're not going to treat the wastewater with a living machine. This is too much. You're going to need a traditional wastewater treatment approach. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of how a traditional wastewater treatment plant works, but what I do want to leave you with before the tour is that there are three major objectives of wastewater treatment. You want to remove organic matter because it'll take oxygen from downstream ecosystems. You obviously want to get rid of pathogenic bacteria. And in a system, in a sophisticated modern system, you want to remove nutrients. And I talked a little bit about that last class, about how that's a little screwed up. Really what you want to do is capture those nutrients and reuse them someplace else instead of getting rid of them. But our technology, the living machine, is actually optimized for getting rid of nitrogen, turning it into atmospheric nitrogen gas, which from my perspective is cool, but also kind of a bummer since we're using 40% of our fossil fuel energy that goes into agriculture fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. But like I say, the purpose of these things is to condense and amplify natural wetland processes to get them to operate 365 days a year. These are some examples of other living machine type technologies. They're not all called living machines. There was a previous technology called solar aquatic wastewater treatment. Same thing, just a different name. Living machine is sort of like almost a brand name. This is our living machine. Like I say, it's a closed loop. You're going to walk through you're going to walk downstream through this system. So you flush the toilet, it goes into an anaerobic ecosystem, a closed aerobic ecosystem, a set of interior tanks, which are in that greenhouse, through a marsh system, into a storage tank, through a UV filter, and back into the toilet. 70% of the water in this building is recycled through that system. Again, I don't have time to go into sort of the details of the nitrogen cycle that takes place here, but one of the goals of that system is to foster ecosystems that process nitrogen in order to ultimately take organic forms of nitrogen in the proteins and urea that come out of your body, and turn it into atmospheric nitrogen gas. That's kind of what it's optimized to do. And different pieces of that transformation take place in different tanks within the system. And like I say, I'm not going to go into the details of what parts of the nitrogen cycle, but is amazingly cool. And if you're interested in it, take my ecosystem ecology course in a couple of years and we'll go into it in great depth and you'll find it really cool. Like I say, all that nitrogen we're turning into atmospheric nitrogen, we put a lot of fossil fuels into fixing that. So I'm going to sort of land, because I have like 1 minute left before you go on a tour, by saying this is really our problem, is that we've separated all of these things. And I just wanted to be clear that although the living machine is an incredibly cool ecological engineered technology, it is kind of an end of the pipeline solution. It's dealing with this piece of the problem here, saying we've created a problem, human beings now create a product that could damage downstream ecosystems, but it's optimized to basically eliminate that problem by turning the nitrogen into nitrogen gas, as opposed to figuring out how do we reverse this thing and make it not an end of the pipeline technology, which it kind of is, but kind of figure out ways to push this thing upstream and get that stuff recycled on farms. And just as an example of that, in the building next door to here, we have a composting toilet. When this building was being constructed, they considered putting composting toilets in here. And people in the administration at the time said, that is too weird. We're not going to have people shitting into a container. That's just too strange. I'll go to the bathroom in the normal toilet. You can do what you want with it downstream from that, but we're not going to have people going to the bathroom in a container. A composting toilet is actually designed to turn human waste into an agricultural fertilizer. So it's an example of actually pushing the solutions upstream a little bit. So you're taking human waste and turning it into something that can be used to produce food for human beings. So for me, like in my last 2 seconds here, because I don't see people at the door yet, for me, what's most valuable about people's experience with the living machine is people are grossed out by poop. You know, poop's a gross thing. Urine's a gross thing, right? They, ew, go away. But you go into the living machine and it's actually beautiful in there. It smells nice in there. It's like it begins to challenge people's perception of what is waste and what is resource. And so for me, when I think about it, its greatest value is not so much it being a great example of ecologically engineered technology, which it is, although it's an end of the pipeline solution, but the fact that it's sort of beginning to challenge people's notion about what's waste, what's resource, how do we rethink society in a way that sort of ultimately, as I've said before, eliminates the concept of waste, where we design our system so the output of one portion of a system, one subsystem, is a valuable input to another system, not something that is a bad thing that we now need to expend a lot of energy getting rid of. So I think I'm going to stop there because we definitely need to trade. So yeah, you guys go out, enjoy your tour, and hopefully our other team is ready to come in here. And you'll come back in here and get your stuff here.
Yeah.
Or I'm free. All right. Okay, so what did you guys notice? What are the things that you found most interesting and surprising in the experience you just had touring the living machine? Yes. It smelled really good. Cool. I like that. Yes, I always notice that too. It smells great in there. It's yes.
I always thought like all the stuff in the main building with the waterfall was targeted. I didn't know it was just good findings.
Yeah, so you thought things were connected a little bit differently. There's some intentionality psychologically in putting all these things together. A lot of people think that the living machine is connected with the wetland outside. We very intentionally, although they're covered up right now, I don't know why they're still covered up, but the water fountains we put right in front of the living machine, we did that intentionally so that you'd be sort of looking at the living machine while you were drinking water. That water actually does not come out of the living machine, but we still wanted you thinking about that while you were doing that. So there's that sort of connection. Yes, that water is ultimately this water. There's, it all goes, it's all the same water. Yeah. Reese, what did you notice? What was most striking to you about it? Yeah, there's a lot of layers to it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's the modularity of the system is really important to this field of ecological design, because what we're trying to do is actually take things that would occur over large space in nature, so that would involve ecosystems that were kind of like adjacent to each other, but maybe occupying, tens of square miles, and put them all together next to each other, because each ecosystem has a different function. But the only way we can do that is by sort of modularizing them and putting them in tanks. So there's a different ecosystem in every single tank there, but they're right next to each other, as opposed to in nature where there'd be a lot of space between those things. Anything else anyone thought was particularly cool or interesting about what they just saw? Or surprising for that matter? All right, so where Ben was kind of giving you a hands-on tour, showing you like how water traveled. I think he took you down the pathway of water flow, is that right? Yeah, from where it comes in. The really gross stuff that comes into the living machine, and the pretty much clean stuff that comes out of the living machine. So I'll walk you through that, but what I want to do first is to sort of give you like really broad context for how that particular technology fits into this whole field that we call ecological engineering. And just on the details, I just wanted to say, hopefully people got their interviews set up. Hopefully you guys are pretty far along in those interviews. If you're having problems, as some of you are connecting with your interviewees, please reach out to Harriet and I will help you out. Do our best to do that. I'd say you got to contact people. Contact people at least 3 times before you assume they're not getting back to you. One email is definitely not sufficient. These people are busy. They all volunteered to participate in this, but doesn't mean that they aren't overloaded with emails or phone calls like the rest of us. So yeah, and that hopefully you got the survey. I'll give you an extra day to do that. That should have shown up last night. Okay, so those are just some things I wanted to say. All right, so what I'm going to do is the field we're talking about today, ecological engineering, is kind of a subfield of this area we talked about before, ecological design. So I'm going to do a little bit of review just to sort of situate ourselves in a place in which I can talk about how ecological engineering fits within ecological design. So I'm going to sort of breeze through some stuff that we've already talked about. Obviously many times now we've talked about the fact that for most of human history, modern human history, where we were principally an agricultural people, not everyone was agricultural, but for the last 10,000 years, most of the world's population lived and worked in places that produced food on farms. The energy for the farms came from the sunlight. Material was locally recycled within those farms. They were pretty much sustainable like other ecosystems. Obviously, we've talked ad nauseum at some level about the sort of transition, fossil fuels, positive feedback, huge exponential increase in the use of fossil fuels, that fundamentally transforming our agricultural system. So a lot of the energy going into producing food is now fossil fuel energy, not just solar energy, one-way through flow of material, substantially increased our production of food, in some ways made a lot of people live better lives, more comfortable lives. So, you have to acknowledge that. Dramatically increased the scale and the separation of people from their food resources. So we talked about, what modern agriculture looks like. The impact of modern agriculture, that's the Mississippi River drainage basin, the largest watershed in the United States. It all drains out the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a big dead zone around there because of all that agricultural activity, all the nutrients, stuff that run off from there. So it's a problem. We talked about this idea of, over the last 150, 200 years, this sort of growing separation, people migrating from farms into cities, those nutrients that used to be recycled on farms, other materials that used to be recycled now ending up in landfills or going into aquatic bodies. Again, the sort of first initial separation occurring in the 19th and early 20th century of people moving into cities, and where their waste used to go back and be an input to production of food, it now is a problem that we need to treat with wastewater treatment. So that's partly what the living machine is about, is still dealing with that issue. And then last century, how we actually specialize different parts of agriculture. So we have food animals produced in spaces that are different from where we produce the grain that feeds the food animals. And therefore we've got an additional problem, not just human waste, but animal waste that we gotta deal with and treat and try to solve. We talked about this sort of psychological separation of people from their food. Most people's experience with food is might look like the area on the right. They don't have a good sense of where the stuff is coming from or how it affects things. So that's all a little bit of a preface to say, one of the exciting developments in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of kind of big environmental challenges, realizations of global climate change, and a lot of things that are at some level kind of a bummer to deal with environmentally. One of the exciting things that's happened in a lot of communities is this sort of discovery of local foods and, thinking about people thinking much more intentionally about where does my food come from? What's the implications of what I eat on the natural world around me? Are there ways for me to engage in sort of the process of acquiring my food that is going to result in greater sustainability? So the development of local farmers markets, community supported agriculture, all of that is sort of people kind of taking control over the input side to their bodies. One thing that we haven't yet seen that I hope you're getting a little bit inspired by having just gone on a tour of the living machine is kind of thinking about the other end of that. So there's been like a strong local foods movement. We haven't yet seen a parallel movement, a local poop movement. People thinking about, well, what happens to my poop? How can I engage in that? How can I think about that? How can I think about the implications of that on the natural environment? So in some ways you think that would be a natural extension. People are thinking about what's going into their bodies. Are they thinking about what's coming out of their bodies and the implication of that? And the answer is no, they're not really doing that much yet. But I do want to point out, this is all about modern psychology. This sort of idea that we don't think about where our food comes from and we don't think about where our waste goes is learned behavior. That's just a cultural behavior. There are many communities in the world, all over the world, that do think pretty intensely about that. And this is actually my niece when she was a child. She's no longer a child, she's now older than you. But it's a cute photo, I still use it. Kids are not born with like this sense of separation. They're fascinated by food, where food comes from. They're equally fascinated by poop, where poop goes to, those sorts of things. Just a little side note on this child. She is just finishing up her PhD in food systems at Berkeley. So she retained that interest in where her food comes from and where her waste goes and those sorts of things. So it's possible to retain that interest. But for most people, you know, you flush the toilet, water goes down a drain, out of sight, out of mind. You don't know what happened to it. You don't think about who's dealing with that or how it's affecting the downstream environment. It's all part of this sort of decoupling of human beings from the resources on which we depend, the implications of the waste materials we produce. It's all part of that. And as we talked about many times, you know, the challenge for us is that's sort of a best case scenario graph of a population growing on a non-renewable resource. It goes up as we exploit the resource, and then as the resource is depleted, it goes down. In fact, as I said a bunch of times, our problem is much worse than that. If our problem was just we were running out of fossil fuels, that wouldn't be so bad. We're pretty good at figuring out slow transitions. The problem is that it turns out that fossil fuel, worse than running out of it, it's polluting the whole atmosphere in a way that's, you know, fundamentally damaging the life support system on which all of us depend, and is likely to result not in this sort of gentle downslope movement that you see in this Hubbert's curve, which you read about earlier, but probably more extreme if we continue to exhibit the same behavior. So we need to desperately figure out a way to get out of this situation. And we began talking about that. What we're looking for here is some sort of gentle landing from our current situation. How do we transition from the reality we have right now to a reality that is genuinely sustainable in a way that's not incredibly painful? And in particular, I think, you know, all of us have been recognizing over the last couple decades that environmental justice is central to this challenge, in the sense that the implications of what we've been doing are borne first by people in poor areas of the world and poor sections of the developed world. So people in the global south, what we used to call developing countries, are going to be affected first and hardest by a lot of these problems we're creating. So we really do want to think about solutions that, you know, work in a global context, and that can be deployed in communities that are first affected by these problems. So how do we get there? Well, you know, part of it is about renewable energy technology and figuring that sort of stuff out, and we've talked about that. But getting back to this idea of ecological design, there's a subfield of ecological design called ecological engineering. Both of these are sort of designed for that transition. The idea is, you know, how can we get from here to where we need to be in a way that you know, achieves the broad goals of sustainability. And this is a overhead we talked about a couple classes back when we were first talking about ecological design. So I'm not going to repeat these things. These are 10 principles of ecological design. We talked about how when you're thinking about ecological design, you do want to give deep thought to issues of equity and justice, issues of economic viability, and issues of ecology, and sort of, you know, think about all of those, even as you think about resiliency. Okay, so that's everything I've said so far basically is things we already talked a little bit about when we introduced the concept of ecological design. I want to now focus again on this sort of one particular area of ecological design called ecological engineering. So ecological engineering focuses basically on the biological / ecological side of ecological design. It can be defined as the facilitated development of whole, complex, solar-powered, resource-efficient ecosystems that are designed to maximize specific ecosystem goods and services. So I will post these overheads, but the definition is important because the emphasis here is on working with natural ecosystems in order to construct ecosystems that are designed to maximize particular things that human beings need. So they're not natural ecosystems, they're constructed ecosystems, but they're constructed ecosystems that run on sunlight and are specifically designed to maximize goods and services. Any questions before I keep going? Because I know I'm sort of powering through here. Okay, so I'm using these terms ecosystem goods and services, and I think I've used those terms before in the class, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those because they're very important concepts, especially as we begin to think about relationships between ecological design and economics. So if we think about human beings as living in like a human sphere and there being all these ecosystems around us, there are a couple things we want the ecosystems in the world around us to do to help us out, to maximize particular goods and services. One of the goods we want from nature is food, fuel, and fiber. All of those things we want to get from nature around us. And when we talk about that, what we're basically talking about is trying to maximize sustainable yield. That is, we're asking the question, how much can we extract from the natural world without damaging the natural world in any way? So what's the maximum sustainable yield we can get out of the natural world without damaging it? The sustainable means we're not damaging what we might term natural capital. Natural capital is sort of the ecosystem infrastructure. So just as an example, and I've used this example a bunch of times now, when you ride your bike or walk over Plum Creek after a rainy day, you see all that brown material in there, which you now know is topsoil from farm fields upstream. What you're looking at is damage to the natural capital. So the sustainable yield in the future in those upland farm streams is going to be less because they're losing topsoil. So we are not managing those farms. Those farms are being managed to produce lots of food. In some cases, they're also being managed to produce fuel because some of that corn's turned into biofuel. But it's fundamentally unsustainable because there's lots of fossil fuel going into the system and we're damaging the topsoil, losing the topsoil so that it will not be able to produce as much in the future because it's going away. So that's not a sustainable system. If we want sustainable yield, we have a system that can produce in perpetuity using solar energy. Okay, so the input side is one important thing, things we're getting from the world around us, food, fuel, and fiber. But the other important thing, another important thing to think about when we think about maximizing goods and services is the output side of society. So we produce stuff now that we call waste, and that waste goes into the ecosystems around us, whether that be CO2 or carbon monoxide or sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, all the pollutants we generate, synthetic organic compounds that go into the environment. We want the ecosystems around us to be able to absorb that material, clean that material, so that it doesn't hurt us or other living things. So that's an assimilative capacity side. So sustainable yield is goods, food, fuel, and fiber. Assimilative capacity is detoxification of things that we create, sucking them out. So we want our ecosystems to be designed to do both of those things or manage to do both of those things. And then increasingly, we're also interested in stability and resilience. So trying to foster the development of ecosystems that provide us with stability and resilience, especially in the face of extreme climate change. And, some of what I'm saying may seem a little bit abstract now, but actually, the examples are pretty straight up. Planting a lot of street trees so you have shade is providing us resilience against, the increased number of days over 90 degrees that we're going to have. So it's keeping things cool for people with shade. It's providing a lot of surface area for absorbing water during extreme flooding events and putting it back into the atmosphere through the leaves. So it's a lot of this stuff is actually what you actually do is pretty straight up, but it requires careful thought. How do we manage our street trees as an ecosystem to maximize those goods and services? And we could get really creative about it and say, can we produce street trees that do that, but also produce food for us? Can they produce nuts, fruits, whatever, something that we're getting these multiple different functions out of them, both on the input side, also on the output side of these things. So anyway, lots of different sort of applications of ecological engineering. Pollution treatment, which is what we're focusing on today with a tour of the living machine. That's an example of using a constructed ecosystem to take waste material and detoxify it, make clean water out of dirty water. We've talked about restoration of ecosystems, mitigation. Biomanipulation is an approach to taking an existing ecosystem and basically tweaking it in some way in order to get it to produce goods and services for us. This is something that human beings have been doing for a long time. The native peoples who lived in this area, for instance, used to do controlled burns of forest ecosystems to clear out the understory a bit because it made better habitat for deer, which they hunted for food. So they biomanipulated their forest ecosystems in order to maximize the production of meat for themselves. So we've been doing that sort of thing for a long time, but a lot of examples of how you can go into an existing ecosystem and just tweak it a bit so that it produces more goods and services for human beings. Maybe that's lumber, maybe that's particular organisms that we want to harvest from the ecosystems. But yeah, that's something we can do. I mean, actually, a good example of biomanipulation right now. The controversy I was listening to on the radio last night is these fires going on the West Coast right now. Apparently one of them was started as a prescribed burn. Prescribed burns are necessary. That is, you intentionally go in and you light fires in forests because we've suppressed fires for so long. So we have biomanipulated our forests in a bad way, in the sense that if you suppress fires, you build up a lot of very flammable material in the fire, and then in the forest, and then when you do get a fire, you get a really extreme fire. And so one of the biomanipulations we have begun engaging in the last decade or so is intentionally going in and creating smaller burns in order to get rid of a lot of that wood, which would result in very large burns if it spontaneously caught on fire. The problem is, with the uncertainty of climate change, changes in weather conditions, this particular prescribed burn got out of hand and resulted in a very much larger and damaging fire than was intended, which is obviously a really bad thing, but also a bad thing for people who are proponents of prescribed burns, because now it gets a bad name, and potentially we stop doing prescribed burns, which means we build up a lot more flammable material in forests, which means we're much more vulnerable to an extreme fire in the future. So it's complicated to think about these sorts of things in the context of changing ecosystems that are fundamentally changing as a result of climate change. But didn't mean to say so much about biomanipulation. Sustainable agriculture, that can be thought of as a particular application of ecological engineering. That's where we're trying to construct whole complex solar powered ecosystems that are specifically designed to produce food for human beings. Sustainable agriculture, the same thing, trying to redesign aquatic ecosystems to produce food for us. Ideally, and I've already mentioned this, ideally, what we're trying to do is pack several of these things into the same design. We talked about stacked function when we talked about ecological design in general. How can you get as many useful things happening from a particular design element as possible? We talked about that when we talked, for instance, about the trees on the north side of this building. That earth berm was constructed to insulate the northern side of the building to reduce energy costs for this building, reduce the amount of energy we needed to use. But then we had this nice area which we could plant a fruit orchard in. So it's insulating the building, it's providing this fruit orchard that produces food for us. So we're getting several functions out of that design element. The Chinese are way ahead of us in their thinking about stacking function. You visited the living machine here and saw how it's basically an ecosystem designed to clean water. That's great. In China, they designed similar systems in which they stack 3 functions together. They would be in that same system. They would be producing fish for human consumption, and they would be producing plant material that was then used to feed animals, which would then be used for human consumption. So they'd be stacking these 3 levels of cleaning water, directly producing fish food, and then producing fodder, which could be fed to animals and then used, and then the other animals, not the fish, but terrestrial animals could be harvested for human consumption. So ideally, you're trying to stack multiple objectives into one thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the principles of ecological engineering, and you're going to find that the first several are basically almost the same as sort of general principles for ecological design that we already talked about. We talked about, when you're thinking about ecological design, looking towards nature as a mentor and a model of how things work. Same deal in ecological engineering. Here, it's a little bit more literal. We're looking at ecosystems, at real ecosystems, and saying, how can we design ecosystems that have those principles? You look in a forest, it's got an overstory, it's got an understory, so it's got these layers of production within them. Well, there are many people in this field called permaculture, which is one particular branch of sustainable agriculture, who actually try to mimic that. They'll create forest ecosystems in which they've got, everything is about producing goods and services for humans, but they basically are designing forests that have, different layers with different functions. They're growing mushrooms in the forest floor using those. They have berries in the understory, which are used for human consumption. They're logging the stuff in the overstory. So they've got these multiple functions stacked in there, but it's designed based on a forest ecosystem. Similar with grassland ecosystems, people are trying to design systems that look like natural grassland ecosystems in the sense that they grow perennial grasses that reproduce naturally every year, that you never disturb the soil, but perennial grasses that produce big grains that can be harvested for human consumption. So instead of wheat, which is an annual that you plant every year and then you have to till the soil, you've got soil erosion, you're growing variants of grass that can produce big grains that we can grind up and produce bread out of and feed people with, but they're perennial. It's perennial agriculture. There's this whole institute called the Land Institute in Salinas, Kansas, that their whole focus is on producing perennial grains. So you don't need to plow. You just need to harvest. And so that's like an example again of sort of mimicking the way natural grasslands work, which are dominated by perennial grasses, not by annual grasses. Solar powered, obviously, that's the same, running it on sunlight. Feedback control, trying to introduce the complexities of ecological relationships, which contain lots of feedback within them. This is a little diagram here, lots of feedback within natural ecosystems in controls. Now, this is a principle we haven't talked about when we talked about ecological design in general, but is important to ecological engineering specifically. And that is the idea of guided self-design or self-organization. This is where, when you start an ecological system, you bring in plant material, microbial material, substrate material from many different sources. So when we first started that living machine, we brought in a lot of tropical plants because we knew we wanted something that would be green and would have active plant activity 365 days a year in a temperate climate. So we knew we needed tropical plants in there. But we also brought in a lot of sediment material, microbes, other materials from local ecosystems here. In fact, this may seem like a strange thing, but one of the ways we initiated that was by going down to our local wastewater treatment plant, our traditional wastewater treatment plant down the road, filling a tank full of their sludge, bringing it back here and dumping that sludge in our tanks, because that sludge is full of the whole host of microbes that are doing the kinds of things you want to do in a wastewater treatment plant. So we actually took from our traditional wastewater treatment plant their ecosystem and dumped that in together with all these other ecological elements. And basically the idea of guided self-design or self-organization is, you know, that some of those species you put in there are not going to make it, but you're going to allow them to self-organize based on the input you're putting through there, the waste in this building, and they're going to organize in a way in which they treat that waste. Another key principle is diversity at multiple levels of organization. And what I mean by that is that it's actually several different ecosystems. I already kind of talked about that in the modularity. There's diversity among ecosystems, there's diversity within each tank. And I'm going to put this last one down here because it's connected, modularity. All of this is about taking what occurs in natural ecosystems over, you know, many square miles and condensing it and amplifying it in a very small space that can run 365 days a year in a temperate environment. So that's what we're trying to do. So again, all of these are consistent with the principles I talked about earlier when we were talking about ecological design in general. But there's a particular set of things that are specific to ecological engineering as opposed to ecological design in general. Okay, so there are all these different areas we could talk about today, you know, because we're focusing on the living machine as an example. We're kind of focused on pollution treatment as a particular aspect of this. So kind of the output side, assimilative capacity. That ecosystem is designed to assimilate wastes, treat wastes. There are many ways we could sort of accomplish these goals. Traditional wastewater treatment plants, which were installed all over the United States after the Clean Water Act was passed in 1970, are actually have been very good at detoxifying water, cleaning water. Some people, you know, are concerned that, you know, there's some sort of like they're mostly a chemical process. They are mostly a chemical process, but what they really are is a microbial process, which is also true of the living machine, which is again why we took a bunch of sediment from their system and put it in our system. These large-scale systems tend to involve a lot of fossil fuel energy to make them run, so that's a difference between those systems. They're pretty resource intensive, but they do a good job. You know, we need traditional wastewater treatment systems. They could be improved, and they are being improved, and that's all good for large cities, New York City, Chicago. You couldn't build a bunch of living machines and make them work. Living machines are really appropriate for smaller scale communities. Ecological restoration is another way we could get some of these goods and services, you know, restore a lot of natural wetlands. And I will say there are some communities that have thought about wastewater treatment plants and come to the conclusion that simply restoring a lot of natural wetland ecosystems would do the job for them. There's a famous community in Humboldt, California, in which they thought about putting in a traditional wastewater treatment plant. They did the calculations, and they figured out they could take a large land area that was available, turn it into a big wetland, move all their wastewater into that wetland, and the wetland would treat their wastewater. And they've done that for years, and it's pretty cool. It's a combination wastewater treatment plant bird sanctuary. People go to the wastewater treatment plant to look at birds because it attracts a lot of birds because it's this huge wetland area, and it smells kind of like our system does here, pretty good. Problem though is a lot of places, you know, you don't have the land for doing that, so that's a challenge. So ecological engineering is kind of situated maybe between these different solutions, where it's sort of more targeted, it's much more modularized. It's all of these have their advantages and disadvantages. I'm not arguing that one is the solution. You know, different solutions are appropriate in different places. That was one of the key ecological design principles we discussed about. You want to think about what is this place, what could we do here, what is nature going to help us do here, and then, you know, make decisions based on that. It's not like one solution fits all. Depends on what you're up to. Okay, now you guys probably went over a little bit of this with Ben when you were walking through. But just so what we understand, what are the goals of wastewater treatment? There are three major goals of a wastewater treatment system. One is to remove organic matter because it can harm downstream ecosystems, take oxygen out of them, remove pathogenic bacteria so it can't hurt human beings, other animals, remove nutrients so that doesn't result in algal blooms and eutrophication of downstream ecosystems. I'm not going to go through all the stuff that goes on in a traditional wastewater treatment plant. They too are a modular set of ecosystems, each of which has a different function. In many ways, this system is less different from a traditional wastewater treatment system than you might imagine. It has vascular plants in it, which look really pretty, but most of the work in that system is done by the microbial community, not by those vascular plants. In fact, the function of those vascular plants, as you may have talked about, is really to provide roots, which are then a home for the microbes that are doing the heavy lifting in there. The world is really run by microbes, if you haven't figured that out yet. It's the microbes that make the planet run. Primary gets rid of the big stuff. Secondary is getting rid of the organic matter. Tertiary is getting rid of nutrients. The living machines, basically the idea, as I kind of said, is to condense and amplify natural biogeochemical wetland processes into a small space so they run 365 days a year in a temperate climate. So how do you take this, which looks like an apple salt marsh? This is the Great Sequoia Marsh off the coast of Cape Cod, Whitstable, Massachusetts. How do you get all the biogeochemistry in this system functioning in a bunch of greenhouses? By the way, the living machine is just a particular name for technology that goes by lots of different names. Solar aquatic wastewater treatment is a name that has been used for the same technology. So that's just a variant of it. This is the Oberlin system that you just walked through. You walked, I think, downstream through this set of tanks, looked at that stuff. I'm not going to go into the details of the nitrogen cycle, but that system was more or less designed to optimize a set of different reactions in the nitrogen cycle, each of which requires a different kind of an ecosystem, a different kind of a habitat in order for it to happen. So yeah, right. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but there are these different nitrogen reactions that happen in different tanks. Basically, the important take-home message is that the living machine is designed to take nitrogen that is in organic matter, turn it into nitrogen in water, and turn that nitrogen in water into atmospheric nitrogen. So that's what it's designed to do. What's screwy about that? So that system is designed to take nitrogen and put it into the atmosphere. What seems a little funky about that? Yes?
Well, there's a whole lot of fossil fuel energy used to get that nitrogen into usable form in the first place.
Yes, I feed you up so well. 40% of the fossil fuel energy used in agriculture goes into nitrogen manufacturing. So there's something that's kind of screwy about that. And so going back to this diagram, we have now separated, humans from farms. We've separated food animals from farms. So the living machine is an amazingly cool, ecologically engineered end of the pipeline solution. It's dealing with this problem. So I want us to think a little bit about the reality that at the end of the day, sort of more holistic, and I love the living machine. I did my master's degree on nitrogen transformations and one of its precursor technologies. It's incredibly cool stuff, but we need to think deeply about sort of larger scale solutions that sort of take this challenge and begin to sort of reverse this and think about how we push these solutions upstream. How do we get output? Instead of taking nitrogen that we expended a lot of fossil fuel generating and turn it into atmospheric nitrogen, how do we condense it and get it back on farm fields? For me, the most interesting and important aspect of the living machine is how it challenges people's psychology. That is, waste is gross. You flush the toilet down, it's the yucky stuff you put in the toilet, press the button, it goes away, and you're like, get rid of that stuff, it's gone. The nice thing about the living machine is you go in there and it's like, this is treating poop, it smells pretty good in here. It's got beautiful plants in here. This is pretty neat. I think that's kind of a first step towards getting us to a place where we can think more holistically about solutions. I will say at Oberlin College, and I wasn't here when this happened, but when they were first considering how could we design this building to exhibit recycling of materials, one of the proposals was, well, let's use composting toilets. And at the time, doing that, oh, whatever. It's okay. At the time, when we talked about using composting toilets, basically people in the institution said, that's gross. We're not going to have composting toilets in here. You have to have a normal toilet. You flush the toilet, it goes away. You can have it go into a greenhouse and treat it in a greenhouse. That's all cool. But you can't do that. And so we did this system, but we do have a composting toilet next door in our little lab. So if you ever want to try out a composting toilet, just go into the building next door, take a left and then a left, and you can check out a composting toilet. A composting toilet takes human waste and composts it, turns it into something that can be applied to crops, and you can grow food with it. It doesn't get rid of the nitrogen. It keeps the nitrogen and allows it to be reused. Now, how we do that kind of thing on the scale of whole cities and that sort of thing, that's one of the great challenges and opportunities of your generation, is to figure out how do we take what we now consider waste and condense it and move it back into useful materials. So we have 3 minutes left, and I want to answer any questions anyone had about the living machine in our 3 minutes. Okay. Yes.
Where is like the energy being saved as opposed to like a conventional system? Because it seems like you're still moving stuff around.
Right. Okay, so full disclosure, our system was really designed. It doesn't make sense to have a living machine in a single building like this. That thing's designed to treat thousands and thousands of gallons a day. It usually treats a couple hundred gallons per day. It's actually pretty energy inefficient because we have to run all those pumps, even though we're treating a lot less. So the reality is, it makes a lot of sense in an educational building like this just to demonstrate the technology, but there actually is no energy savings. I've done the calculations. Our local wastewater treatment plant is much more energy efficient than our living machines. I'm just being honest with you about that. If we were treating, 10% of the campus's waste, I think we could probably make this more energy efficient. So yeah, it's not the particular implementation here doesn't make this the most energy efficient example. It's good for education, but you could create a living machine that was much more energy efficient, running it in a solar greenhouse. So yes, it's possible for it to be more energy efficient. This implementation is not, because it's really an educational implementation. Good question. And many generations of students before you've asked that. We did actually at one point get the money to do that, to expand it, tap into, there's a big wastewater line that goes by this building, comes out of Harkness and stuff. And we actually got the funds to do it. And I kind of lost steam on it, mostly because there's a problem of what happens to the water when you've cleaned it. This building isn't going to use more of that water. That water that we would have cleaned is not going to be EPA approved as drinking water, because those are pretty stringent standards. There are communities in the United States that are taking wastewater. In fact, I toured a plant in Singapore a couple of years ago where, basically they take all of their wastewater and turn it into drinking water. It's not a living machine technology, it's reverse osmosis. It's pretty chemically sophisticated, but we couldn't do that here. Point being that all of that water we would have treated here, we'd have to dump it into the drain, and then it would go to the wastewater treatment plant. So there's kind of like, just given how we have the system set up here, if we could use that for landscaping, that would be great. The problem is that the landscaping water needs are here during the summer, and there aren't many people here, so we wouldn't have the input. So there's some timing issues with that. So it's hard in this context. It makes great educational sense, but it doesn't make that much practical sense.
Yeah, would it be possible to put it back into
You have to replumb the other buildings. Yes, it would be possible to do that, but we have double plumbing systems here. We have a gray water system that uses water from the living machine. So every building would have to have 2 plumbing systems in it. That would be, I think that would be what you'd want to do. You'd want to when you're doing a big building renovation, you'd want to create like a gray water system in the building, but you could only do it when you were already doing a big building renovation because it's a lot of work. All right, great guys, thank you. If you have more questions, you should come up and ask me, but hope you had fun. Take care.